My name is Patty Bernard, and I'm a member of the Nevada Women's History Project. Today we are interviewing Marian LaVoy, a descendant of a pioneer Elko family and a civic volunteer for many, many years. This interview is funded through the generosity of the Terry Lee Wells Foundation. Today is Thursday, December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, 2023, and we are in Reno, Nevada. Thank you for interviewing with us, Marian. I've known you for quite a few years and a little bit about your history, which is quite interesting. For the record, could you talk a little bit, state your name, and talk a little bit about the formative years in Elko County?
Well, thank you, Patty. I'm Marian LaVoy. Was born in Elko County, and we were all pioneers. My family were all pioneers in Elko County. My grandfather, Joseph Heenan, came from Germany to avoid being put in the army by the, cannot think of the name of the Kaiser at that time.
Wilhelm, I think.
Kaiser Wilhelm, that's correct. Thank you very much. And he did not want to be put in the army, and so he jumped ship and came to the United States and ended up going to Virginia City. And he found out that Virginia City was not as great as he thought it was going to be for become a gold miner. So then he went up to another area called Hamilton, which no longer exists, I don't think. And there he met my grandmother, who had come from Bavaria, and she had a large family that had migrated to New York. And so she decided she didn't want to stay in New York. She wanted to come out to the rougher places, you know. So she came out and she met my grandfather, and they were married. I think it was in 1870 something, or I think I have the marriage certificate that was given to them. But anyway, he decided that he could no longer make any money with gold mining, which is at that point in time, everyone was coming out west to mine gold. So in Hamilton, I guess that's where he met my grandmother. I don't know what she was doing in Hamilton unless she had relatives that were there, and she had come from New York to stay with the relatives and get a job I don't know doing what. But anyway, she was 20 years younger than my grandfather, which I always thought was rather interesting. The pictures of them show the great difference in the two of them. Now, my grandfather was actually very bald, but he was a very proud German. And so he bought himself a wig while he was in San Francisco. So I never knew him, but every picture that I have, here he is with this very luxurious wig.
And how did he get to Elko?
You know, that well, yes, I do know. He was up in Hamilton, where their mining district was, and that's where he met my grandmother, and they were married. I don't remember exactly where they were married. It was in one of the mining towns. I think they were married in Buell, Nevada, which no longer exists. And then they came to Elko County. Of course, that's Elko County, but they came to the little town of Elko and bought land out out by Lamoille, Nevada. And they planted crops there. And wouldn't you know, at that point in time, Elko had one of the coldest winters that they've had in years. And all of the wheat froze and everything else. And then to top everything else, Anna was having a baby, and the baby was born, and wouldn't you know, shortly thereafter, some sort of a virus came through the area, and they lost the baby. And because he lost all of his crops and everything else, he decided to move up farther into Elko County, up farther, closer to Lamoille, and right at the very base of the Ruby Valley. And that ranch grew from just a little tiny log cabin to the big ranch that it finally became. But one of the most interesting things, this was, I think they were married in 1872, I think. I may be mistaken, but I think that's what it is. And then they were expecting another child, which they had, and Uncle George was born on the, March of 1876. Well, that was the same year as the Custer massacre. And one night, now this was just a little log cabin that they were living in, and they had had their first son, George Heenan. And Uncle George was just a wonderful, wonderful person. But here he was, a tiny, tiny baby, and in the middle of the night, a band of Indians from Idaho came roaring through that part of the country, circling the house and yelling and screaming and all of that. Well, Uncle George, my grandfather, Joe, stood by the door with his gun in his hands, and my grandmother was not too far away, holding my Uncle George close to her so that he wouldn't cry or anything and alert the Indians that there was somebody in the house. Well, my grandfather had always been kind to the Indians. Why, I don't know, but he had been. And so they circled the house with their yelps and all of that. And they were just terrified. They were just terrified. They knew the house would be burned and everything else. Well, lo and behold, after circling the house a number of times with their war whoops and whatnot, they went on to the next ranch, which was farther, about 3 or 4 miles down the road. And the next 2 ranches, there were only 3 ranches in the valley at that particular time in Pleasant Valley. And they stole the cattle and they stole horses and everything. And then they took off to wherever they were going, I guess back to Idaho, I don't know. And when my grandfather managed to open the door early in the morning, he was amazed to find that all of his cattle, he didn't have a lot of them, but all of his cattle and his horses were still in the pens. So he was very, very thankful, very, very thankful for that.
Wow. And you grew up on that ranch then?
Not that particular one. That one was farther up on the mountain. They had moved, as they said, from the what is now called the Ogilvy Field. That was the first place he was, and then he went back up, farther up the mountain. My grandparents managed to build this ranch to over a 3,000-acre ranch before they passed away and whatnot. And my father, Joseph Heenan, was the baby of the family. George, as I had said, was the older one, and Josephine was the daughter, and she rode side saddle, and she could jump any fence in Elko County, or sitting side saddle on the horse, if you can believe such a thing. And then the youngest one was my father, Joe. I imagine that he was a middle-aged child because he was so much younger than the other 2. And Joe was very spoiled as a young boy, as you might guess. And he was sent down to Oakland to attend, I don't know, it wasn't a university, it was a business school of some sort that was in Oakland. And of course, I think he studied girls in San Francisco more than he studied what he should have been studying. But then he came back. My father left the Heenan Ranch to go to school in San Francisco. I believe the school was in Oakland, but anyway, as I say, he did more playing than he did studying. So when he came home, he was working on the ranch with the rest of the family, whose names I just finished saying. And my mother was, her mother and father were from Carson City, Richard and Honora Foley. And they had 7 children, of which 2 had died. And then my grandmother passed away in Lovelock, at the hotel in Lovelock. They had been visiting the ranch in Elko and returned from Elko to Carson City when the train stopped in Lovelock, and they had to stay at one of their friends' homes in Lovelock. And my grandmother died of a heart attack. Fell on top of my mother, as you can imagine. She was about 14. And so after that, she went to the University of Nevada as a high school student, if you can believe they had such a thing there. And she liked it very, very much, but her father felt that she needed to be with her sister someplace. So they sent her up to Elko. So she lived with May and George Heenan on their ranch, which was close to the Ruby Mountains too. Well, she was there. She was quite a handsome young lady, and somebody from Hollywood came to interview her to go to Hollywood in the early 1900s, and she was so excited, as you can well imagine. But her father soon put his foot down, and that was the end of that. So anyway, she was one of the young people that went to the Lamoille the dances and to all of the Lamoille functions that the young people at that time had. And there she met my father. Well, first of all, she met Morley Griswold, because the Griswold ranch was right next door to our ranch. And she and Morley fell madly in love. And he went off to the University of, oh, I'm not just sure which one, it was in the Midwest someplace. And in the meantime, my aunt, who did not like Morley, was gathering up the letters that were coming to my mother from him. And so my mother thought that Morley had completely forgotten her.
And let me just kind of break in. Morley Griswold became governor of Nevada.
Yes. Well, anyway, Morley came home and found out that she was married to my father, and had also had my brother, Donald. He was just a tiny baby at the time. And he was very upset, and of course my mother was more upset, and I think the most upset was my father. So anything from there, the ranch, mother moved out to the ranch and with the baby and whatnot, and lived with her in-laws for a while on the old ranch house. She didn't care for that very, very much, so my dad decided that he was going to go into business in Elko. So he started, no, not my dad, my uncle decided he was going to go into business in Elko, and he started one of the first stables in Elko. And what had happened with my uncle was that he had married someone that my grandparents did not approve of, and so he was banished. He was banished from the ranch and started a, what would you call it, a livery stable in Elko. And then shortly after that, after his wife had passed away and had left a little girl, his wife died of childbirth, and then they sent her to San Francisco because she was very ill, and she passed away in San Francisco. Her husband came back to Elko, George came back to Elko, and the child was being raised by the grandparents. Joseph and Anna were raising the child. Well, in the meantime, my Aunt May Foley was a teacher at Blaine School, which was on the Brennan Ranch in the countryside. And so she and my uncle met and were married. Went to Elko for a real nasty winter that they didn't want to spend out on the ranch. And they rented a house. And of course, I was on my way. I've skipped a whole area. My parents moved into Elko before I was born, because prior to that, my mother had had a son who was born in the new Elko hospital, if you can imagine such a thing. And unfortunately, he died at 2.5. And my first brother, Donald, was born in 1915 in Elko, because my grandparents at that point of time had built a huge house in Elko on Idaho Street. And so they would come in for the weekends or come in whenever they needed anything and stay in that place. So that's where my one brother Donald was born, and my brother Joe was born in a house that was what did they call the ladies that delivered babies?
in waiting, I believe.
Well, whatever it was. And then I was born in a house on Court Street in Elko. Well, from there we went out to the ranch, and I grew up on the ranch, just loving the ranch. And I was one that could never nap. And so my mother was a great napper. So what they used to do is put me on my old horse Curly, and they had the saddle that had belonged to my uncle's daughter. She had passed away, unfortunately, but they put me on that saddle, and then the old Curly would walk around and around and around the ranch house, and of course very seldom did I fall asleep. But sometimes when I did, they would catch me off the saddle and take me in and put me down on the bed to nap so that my mother could nap. And one time, I was dozing off and fell off the horse, down onto the ground. Here I was only about, I'd say 12 or 14 months old. Fell down on the ground, and old Curly had his nose on the top of me, kind of, come on, get up, what's wrong with you? That was the end of the nap for that day, I can tell you that. But I loved living on the ranch. And one year, when I must have been about 3, there was a rabbit infestation in Elko County, and the rabbits were eating the base of all the haystacks, and the haystacks were collapsing. And so all the ranchers around, the Brennans and the Griswolds and the Heenans, got together, and they went out, and to me it sounds horrible, but they bludgeoned the rabbits that were eating the hay. And then, of course, all the rabbits were thrown into the pig pens, if you can imagine such a horrible thing. That's the way they got rid of them. And my grandfather Foley was living with us at that time on the ranch, and he stayed at the ranch house with me and read me stories and whatnot. And then also I had my own horse, and I used to ride in the fields watching the men haying and whatnot. And then as I got a little bit older, why, my uncle would let me drive the derrick, and I would be able to pull the horses away, and the hay would come up and get into the stack. And I loved doing that. I loved living on the ranch, just loved living on a ranch. But unfortunately, by that time, the Depression, the Great Depression had hit. And I don't know why, because my parents evidently were not paying off the mortgage that was on the ranch, which was only $16,000. And I wonder about that many times, because every year we went down to San Francisco to the livestock show that was down there. And we stayed at the hotel that all the Nevada people stayed at. It was a wonderful time, and my folks would stay from when the cattle show was, which I think was in September. They would stay until just before Thanksgiving and then return, which was not a good thing for good ranchers to do. So anyway, we finally ended up, my dad, the bank foreclosed on the ranch, and my dad had to move into Elko and get a job in Elko. And he was the superintendent of the old folks home in Elko for many, many years. And at that time, when my first school that I went to was Rabbit Creek School, and Effie Bowers was the teacher. And Rabbit Creek School is just before you get into Lamoille, Nevada. There's, as you're coming into Lamoille, there's a great big deep ravine which the cars go through, and the ranch was next to it. One of the ranches was next to it, and the school was next to that. And Effie was a wonderful woman, just a wonderful woman. And there were 3 of us that were in first grade. Annabelle Plunkett and Jackie, I can't remember his last name, but Jackie was an Indian boy. And every time that the school nurse would come out to check all of the pupils from first grade to 8th grade, Jackie would piddle on the scales. And she used to get so annoyed with him. She'd have to run get a towel and the whole thing. And that was one of the memories that I just think is so funny, because Annabelle and I used to laugh at him. Jackie was killed at a rodeo from being thrown off a bucking horse, and Annabelle became a policewoman in Las Vegas. Yes, and so anyway, we moved into Elko, and Elko County High School. Well, I moved in when I would have been in, well, I guess I moved in when I would have been in second grade, and that was a brand new school in Elko. It was the North Side School, and we all felt so important being in the brand new school. Miss Shadd was my teacher, and she was a wonderful, wonderful woman. Put up with all of my nonsense because being a country kid in a city school, I was lost. That's all there was to it. And many times she would come, I would be crying in class, and she would come and hug me and say, oh, everything's all right. And there, Helen Harper was one of the students there too. And she would come and hug me and say, it's all right, you're going to be fine. But all I wanted to do was go back to the ranch, which I couldn't. So anyway, through high school, I had a lot of wonderful teachers and was very active with many of the organizations. In fact, with the theater group. I was in a lot of the different plays for the 4 years that I was in high school. And then also my mother insisted I become musical, so I had taken piano lessons from Mrs. C.C. Clark. And then when Prof. Beardsley became the music teacher at the Elko High School, he took me under his wing for a different type of thing and taught me how to play the organ at the old Hunter Theater in Elko. So I was quite musical. I belonged to the Glee Club and everything else. So we put on many a play, and I still have some pictures of myself in the plays, and Jack Berry was another one that was active in the theater. Then in 1942, when my senior year, I graduated from Elko High School. And then my family, who had bought a house in Elko and had been living in it, my dad decided he didn't want to work where he was anymore, so he went down to work with the highway department in Nevada. And so we moved to Carson City for a summer. My mother and I moved, and we stayed at a lady's house. I cannot remember her name right at the moment. Now, my dad had moved first while Mother and I stayed in Elko, and then when he found a place to live in Carson, we moved down to Carson. It was very, very interesting. I was a senior in high school, and so my folks found a piece of property up at Lake Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe. And so they took the option to buy that. And so they moved up to a trailer house in Lake Tahoe. And of course, Catherine Lebersky from Elko was a good friend of mine. And so she moved up as a partner with me up to Lake Tahoe. And we all stayed, as I say, in this big trailer that my folks had rented to put on the property. Well, wouldn't you know, we both decided we wanted to get a job, and there was a little restaurant next to us. And I worked one shift, and she worked another. And lo and behold, who comes in but John Garfield, the movie star? He's up there with a girlfriend, I suppose. And I just hated to see that man come into that restaurant. He was always patting my fanny, and I tried my best to get away from him, but somehow or other, I just was never quite fast enough. And when I'd see him come, I'd run to the kitchen so that somebody else that was there, so the owner could wait on him, because she thought he was wonderful. And I thought, oh, you nasty old man.
Let me take you back a little bit. So you graduated from Elko High School.
In 1942.
And then moved to Carson.
Then moved to Carson.
And then moved to Lake Tahoe.
Mm-hmm.
When did you start the university? Was this time between?
No. It was my senior year of high school that I lived up at Lake Tahoe.
Oh. Okay.
And we had it was a small lake. Everybody was friendly. There was so much to do. We all loved to dance at Camp Richardson. It used to be a very small little place up there. We loved living there, just loved it. But then it came time to go home. So I had to go back home to Elko, and I lived with my Aunt May and my Uncle George on Pine Street. Well, my senior year in high school was a very interesting year. We did so many things and had so many plays and so many outings. We'd go out to the summit and start a bonfire and cook hot dogs on the top of the summit. A whole bunch of us would do this. And at that time, I very foolishly thought I was in love with one of the young gentlemen in Elko. And so he was going to the university, and I don't know whether I should mention his name or not. What is your thought on it?
Not a problem. He's long gone.
Well, yes. Maurice McBride and I became engaged on graduation night in Elko. Well, my father was furious. He didn't approve of it. My mother was very much in favor of it because the McBride family owned the electricity company in Elko, and we're a very prominent family in Elko. But finally, I came to my senses, and I said, no, he's just too demanding and too bossy. And of course, I'm bossy myself. So I gave him back his ring, which caused, more problems with my friends in Elko than you could ever imagine. But by that time, I was headed for the university, and I was going to go to normal school, which was a 2-year program at that point in time. And when I came down to the university, my mother moved down to Reno with me, and we lived in the house at 721 Sierra Street, which is now part of the freeway. And I became a member of the Tri-Delt sorority, and my big sister was Kennedy. I can't think of her first name right at the moment, but it was a very interesting year. You know, coming from a rural county and being so dumb, I guess is the best word I could use. It was just very interesting to become a member of the Tri-Deltas. And then, of course, the courses that I had at the university, the 2 teachers that were just so interesting. One of them must have been about, well, now thinking back, she was probably only about 45 years old, but I thought she was so old, you know. And she's the one that taught me teaching. And then I played the piano for the dance classes for Miss Sampson, I believe her name was, to make money to pay for my sorority dues, which were $15 a month. And mind you, my university, my credits were just about $15 a month. Can you believe that with the way they are now? So anyway, I loved all the teachers that I had at the university. And my second year, I went out practice teaching. And I will never forget Miss Rita Cannon. She was the principal of one of the schools that is no longer a school. But she was such a wonderful lady. And she just taught me so many things. I really appreciated it. And then I went up to Mount Rose School. I believe that's the name of it. I went up to Mount Rose School and had a lady from Winnemucca as my mentor for learning to teach. I cannot at the moment think of her name, but she was from Winnemucca and a lovely lady. I graduated from the university in 1944 and got a position in Gardnerville. Well, in the meantime, I had met my John LaVoy from Sparks, and he was a young pilot at with the Marine Corps. So he had just returned from the South Pacific, and he asked me to marry him. And I thought, well, it's either I marry him and have my life, because all the young men were getting killed that I knew. The Elko people were getting killed in the South Pacific. And so he said, all right, he said, I'd love to marry you. And he said, but he said, I don't know if I'll have to go back again. And of course, I loved him dearly. I really did. And so he and I got married on September the 26th, 1944, at the St. Thomas Aquinas Cathedral. And from there, we honeymooned in San Francisco for a lovely 2 weeks. Then we went back to Chicago and were there for a week while he was doing carrier landings, learning how to fly the planes on carriers. And on these planes, his first tour, he was flying SBDs, and on this tour, this time of practice in Chicago, he was flying SB-2Cs, and all of these were dive bomber pilots. So we were married at the cathedral by Monsignor Luigi Rotaglia, and then left for San Francisco for our honeymoon, and then went back east. And this, well, you will never believe, we landed in Washington, D.C., and from Washington, D.C., caught a train down to Goldsboro, North Carolina. Well, when we got to North Carolina, I had never seen anything like this in my life. There was a black drinking fountain, there was a black bathroom, there was a black waiting room, and the theaters, the blacks had to sit upstairs. I could not get over this because we had only had one black family in Elko all the time I was growing up, and Herschel was a great friend of all of ours, you know. But this just really bothered me. It really bothered me. And John then was stationed at Quantico, learning how to call dive bombs in, because the line company Marines, they were calling bombs in on their own people. So they wanted pilots that would know where the bombs were going to hit and whatnot. So he went to that, I think it was AGOS, but I'm not sure, school. And we lived in Washington, D.C., because there were no quarters at all in Washington, D.C., and we had just come from living with people in New Bern, North Carolina, because John had been stationed at Cherry Point, and from Cherry Point we had to go back up to Washington, D.C., and there was no place at all to live at Quantico where he was, not at all. And so another friend and I lived in Washington, D.C. at Connecticut and S, which was a huge boarding house filled with people from France and England and all over who had come to Washington, D.C. because of the war to represent their countries. So we went, the first place that we saw an ad in the paper to, the Filkins and John and I went to look at the place. We walked in, and they showed us a lovely living room and dining room and whatnot, and a bathroom. And I said, well, where are the bedrooms? Well, they opened a next door house window, and we had to climb over the sill to get in to the next place, and there were 2 bedrooms there. Well, we thought, this is ridiculous, my God. And Sue was pregnant, so we couldn't have her climbing from house to house, you know. So then we thanked them very much and went on and finally found a place that was at Connecticut and S, I believe it was. And it was a boarding house, and there were people living there from all over the world. And they had breakfast for us, and they had dinner for us. And so I stayed there with Sue during the week, while John and Elmer was his name, were down at Quantico, learning how to call bombs in on targets. Well, I spent all the time, she was not feeling well, so I spent all the time going through Washington, D.C., going to all the art galleries and all of the places that were of interest, so that when John came home on Saturday morning, why I could take him to see all these places that I had seen. And it was just very, very interesting. We went to the old Mellon and to all of these different places. And then, of course, Sunday night, that both men had to go back to Quantico. So then we were back again at just Sue and myself. And then the next week I would do the same thing. And this lasted for, I think about 4 months. And then it was back to North Carolina, to Cherry Point. John and I had a wonderful life in the military. We were stationed at El Toro and at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina and at Cherry Point, North Carolina, and in Omaha, Nebraska, which is hard to believe, And then John just many times was gone, and I would return to Reno and stay with my folks who were living in Reno at that time. Well, finally, after 28 and a half years of traveling, going to all these different bases and living in Hawaii, oh, we love living in Hawaii. And after John retired, which he retired in 1972, and then we returned to Reno. And he taught school at Hug High School. He taught there for 6 years, and then we bought the ranch in Fallon because he had become fond of bees and was a beekeeper on the side. So we bought a ranch in Fallon that was 21 acres, and we lived there for almost 20 years. And then as he was getting older, we couldn't take care of the cattle and the horses and whatnot, you know. Loved Fallon. I was very, very active in Fallon, in many of the organizations, and received many, many rewards from the organizations. I have a wall full of plaques, which I'm very proud of, but my kids will probably put in the garbage, you know. We love living in Fallon, but finally, we bought another house. We had the ranch, the 21-acre ranch, and then we bought a house in Fallon with the idea of retiring there. But our children had a double hissy, and we ended up coming into Reno, and we bought a home that had belonged to Louis LaVoy on Riverside Drive, 1055 Riverside Drive, and we lived there for a great number of years. And in fact, if I recall correctly, John passed away at that home on Riverside Drive, and so then I was left by myself. And my son Donald was now a colonel in the Marine Corps, and my daughter Michelle was married to a young man from someplace near the base in California. I can't think of the name. He wasn't a military man, but she married him and lives down there. And my youngest son started a business here in Reno, and he's still here in Reno, so I'm very fortunate.
I want to take you back to some of your time in Fallon, though, because I know that you worked for the
Museum.
Churchill County Museum, and you were doing oral histories at that time.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about your volunteer work with the museum?
Mm-hmm. Well, at the museum, I can't think of Jane's last name. She was the curator.
Peeplo.
What?
Peeplo.
Joan Peeplo was head of the museum, and I've always been involved in every organization that I could possibly be involved in. And the museum was very, very, very interesting because I interviewed. Well, first of all, I took my course from a lady that came to the museum from Nebraska and taught us how to do oral histories. And I love that because I met all of the old people that had become the pioneers of Fallon. And it was just so interesting finding out how they came out and they lived in little old shacks, and then the dam was built, and Fallon became a larger town, although it's still not very big. And then the Air Force came out and moved out there. And of course, John was always being invited to give talks at the Air Force functions. So we loved Fallon dearly and made such good friends there. Now, of course, I hate to say, being as old as I am, that all of our good friends, except two, are gone. So I don't know too many people in Fallon anymore, just 3 or 4. I forgot to mention that on our military career, John, after we returned to the States, and we were stationed at El Toro, he got assigned to the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and he was working with the Undersecretary of the Navy in Washington, D.C., and our life in Washington, D.C. was unbelievable because we went to the I was asked to be a hostess at the Holland, oh my God, they're state houses. embassy. I was asked to work at a flower show at the embassy in Holland, Holland Embassy, and I will never forget the tulips. The entire embassy was filled with tulips of every color, and I swear that those tulips were 5 inches long. Every color you could ever imagine, completely through. And of course, it was days for people to travel through the embassies and see all the different things. But that Holland embassy duty was just fascinating because of the tulips.
And your interest in flowers was roses, I believe.
Oh, yes. I had 72 rose bushes. Some of them are the antique rose bushes, some of them are modern bushes and whatnot. And I belonged to the Rose Society, which I don't know whether it exists anymore or not. And we put on, at the rose shows, I never went home without at least one blue ribbon for something or other, you know. And the people with the Rose group were a lovely, lovely bunch of people. Most all of them are dead now. I hate to say that, but.
Well, and I want to mention that in 1978, I discovered that you had been named one of the Women of Now and made the newspapers.
Women of the Year in Fallon.
In Reno.
Oh.
Would that be 1978? Would that be in Fallon, or was that?
No, I tell you, I was a Woman of the Year for the PEO, for the AAUW, for Parks and Recreation, because I was on that board for years. And another one for Woman of the Year was all in Fallon.
Oh.
And then in Reno, I got plaques because I was on the Reno Parks Commission for many, many years. The Reno Parks Commission, and from the Reno Parks Commission, I went to the Reno Tree Advisory position, and from there, then we moved to Fallon, so I didn't.
So you had many, many years of volunteer.
Oh my God, I'd hate to add it all up, being very honest with you. I love to volunteer, and I love the people that were involved in the volunteering.
So that kind of brings us to, you are now 98.
Oh, 98 and 3/4.
And 3/4. How would you like to be remembered for a life of the activities that you led?
I would just like to be remembered as good old Marian, you know. I don't expect any adulation or anything like that. And I'm mother of my children, and my grandmother of, I think I have 14 great-grandchildren. So.
Marian, you have had a life of volunteering in so many organizations. Why is volunteering important to you?
Well, I truly have always liked people. I've always liked people, no matter who they are. People, whether they're purple, black, or whatnot. But I've always liked people, and I've always tried to be friendly to people. And most people return that friendliness, which makes me feel good.
I think that's wonderful. Thank you so much for the time that you have spent with us talking about your life. I know that you had so many experiences as a military wife. And as a matter of fact, we have on our website a program that you were a part of on military wives.
Oh, really?
And so we thank you for your service as a military wife, and certainly thank you for the time that you have given us today.
Well, thank you. And I tell you, being a military wife is not easy.
No, you should have as much in adulation as your husband. Thank you.
Thank you very much.